3 generations of Murdaugh's portraits hang in the courtroom. They were one of the most powerful families in the area for over 100 years. We know what created the fall of the Murdaughs, but what created the rise? Is Alex the first Murdaugh to live outside the law while pretending to stand for justice? How far back does the corruption really go? We've all been asking these questions. Let's get to some answers. I'm Cassidy O'Connell, and this is The Murdaughs, Rise and Fall, a special edition of The Other 55%, because we don't know the half of it. I just watched the autobiography of Michael J. Fox called Still, which I highly recommend, by the way. It was a really moving story, but he's very honest about himself. He starts by telling his humble beginnings, and you see him destitute in Hollywood, sometimes eating snatched jelly packets from IHOP because he was so hungry and had no money. You see him nervously awaiting news that he got his breakout part, Alex Keaton, on Family Ties. He's humble and desperate. He works hard to play the character to earn the part because not everyone is on board with him having it. He gets the part. He's charismatic, kind, and grateful. He becomes a huge success and is chosen to play his most famous part of all time, Marty McFly in Back to the Future, and it profoundly changes him. It showed a clip of him working with the crew after filming Back to the Future, and the once humble, hungry, cooperative man is gone. Everything about the way he speaks to the crew, the way he carries himself, and the things he says are just night and day difference. What was the difference? Privilege. Just like the saying, power corrupts, give a man a little power, a little prestige, a little authority, and wow, you can bring out the worst in them. Historically, when you take that kind of authority, power, and prestige, and it flows through generations, you've got some real trouble with their view of the world and their place in it. Keeping this in mind, I went into the Murdaugh family history. The furthest back I could find was estimated at the year 1700, with John Murdaugh II, who was married to Miriam Jordan. The dates are guesses. I guess there isn't a lot of paper trail for back then. And in these cases, I don't list all of their offspring. I focused on the line that leads to the modern-day Alex Murdaugh family. So in this case, Josiah Murdaugh, born 1737 and died 1779. Josiah Murdaugh married Cynthia Brown, and they produced Lazarus Murdaugh Sr., born in 1774. Lazarus Murdaugh Sr. married Mary Wilson, and they had Josiah Putnam Murdaugh, born December 25th, 1793. The oldest picture of any Murdaugh was this one, of Josiah Putnam Murdaugh. He becomes a senior when he names his son after himself. There aren't a lot of pictures of the women till more recent times, so unfortunately I mostly have gravesite pictures until the modern generations. In this case, Josiah Putnam married Mary Ursula Varn, and they had Josiah Putnam Murdaugh Jr., born September 10th, 1830. Now finally in the 1800s we start to find a lot more information about the family, since records started being kept a little bit better. Josiah was a wealthy, low-country businessman and Confederate States Army veteran. He married Anna Marvin Davis, who claimed to be related to the first, last, and only president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, who owned a cotton plantation with over 110 slaves. Her obituary says that her birthplace was the beautiful estate Dorchester, so often mentioned by William Gilmore Simms, the South Carolina writer. Annie came from a wealthy family, and Josiah was a successful businessman who started his wealth with phosphate mining and commercial fertilizer industries, then expanded to real estate. So at least from this far back, there was wealth in the family. They are the parents of Randolph Murdaugh Sr., the first in the line of lawyers in the family, whose name is still carried throughout his bloodline. Randolph attended public school until high school, when he switched to a private school. He then attended U.S. Naval Academy and graduated from the University of South Carolina in 1908 and from its law school in 1919. He also married well. Her name was Etta Causey Harvey. She was the daughter of a prominent local physician, Dr. Joseph Brantley Harvey. They married in 1914 and had 2 sons, Randolph Murdaugh Jr., known as Buster, and John Glenn Murdaugh, known as Johnny. We know the route Buster took, but Johnny Murdaugh joined the United States Army and served as a paratrooper. He was the highest decorated veteran of World War II from Hampton County, receiving a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts. After the war, he retired to become a farmer. Unfortunately, the only pictures I could find of Etta are of her marriage certificate, gravesite, and death certificate. She died less than 3 weeks after giving birth to Johnny. Her death certificate says she died from sepsis, most likely an infection from a childbirth complication. Randolph was very ambitious and tried out his hand in many different fields. He opened his one-man law firm in Hampton in 1910, where he served as the town attorney. He served 2 two-year terms on the school board and was a 3-time delegate for the Hampton County to the Democratic Party State Convention. And if that wasn't enough, he founded the Hampton County Herald in 1916, a newspaper which ran until 1919. In 1920, when the incumbent solicitor resigned to run for the Senate, he ran against Heber Paget and was elected to become the solicitor in the 14th Judicial Circuit, where he served until his death in 1940. He started his career with guns blazing, cleaning out corruption from higher levels, such as 2 county auditors, W.A. Mason and T. Haygood Gooding, who had already been prosecuted by the State Tax Commission in 1919, yet had been re-elected as Hampton County Auditor. Murdaugh prosecuted both of them, leading to their removal from office. 2 years later, in 1922, he prosecuted Colleton County Sheriff W.B. Ackerman for embezzlement. Ackerman later killed himself while in the process of closing up office. As we read in the January 14, 1925 edition of the Aiken Journal and Review, it says, Dr. W.B. Ackerman, the retiring sheriff of Colleton County, was found dead at his home in Walterboro Friday afternoon and is said to have taken his own life by firing a revolver bullet into his head. The news of his death came as a shock to the community. He had been indisposed for a day or 2 and was in bed Friday, but had seen a number of callers on business matters. Deputy Sheriff F.H. Beach had been to see him and found him, he said, despondent, but discussed some matters with them connected with his closing up of the business of his office. Sheriff Lucas C. Paget took charge of the office last week, but had not permitted the books and records turned over to him. He required that the office be checked by an accountant, and Mr. E. E. Jones of the Comptroller General's office is getting ready to begin checking the office. He was replaced by Lucas C. Paget, who had previously served as sheriff of Colleton, as seen in this article about the Spanish flu lockdown from 1918. On October 9, 1918, it reads, acting on orders received from the State Board of Health Monday, Louis C. Paget, sheriff of Colleton County, has given instructions that all churches, schools, theaters, and other places where people gather be closed during the Spanish influenza epidemic. The telegram to Sheriff Paget follows, and it goes on to give the instructions of how to observe the lockdown for the epidemic. It's very much like what we just went through 102 years later. Randolph also prosecuted a lot of bankers during the financial collapses of the Great Depression, including 3 prominent Hampton County banks, Merchants and Planners Bank of Arnville, the Merchants and Planners Bank of Brunson, and the Bank of Hampton. He also prosecuted 2 Beaufort County bankers, and even 2 officers of the First National Bank and Trust in faraway Lancaster. In 1924, he prosecuted Governor Wilson G. Harvey for accepting deposits while knowing his bank was failing and insolvent. The case played out in Allendale, outside of his home turf of Hampton, where he faced prominent lawyer Edgar A. Brown of Barnwell. But in spite of his courtroom dramatics, such as putting the governor in the prisoner dock while the indictment was read, he lost the case. The next year, however, Harvey pleaded guilty to charges for lending excessive amounts of the Enterprise Bank's money to the Consolidated Truck and Auto Company of Charleston, a company he held sizable interests in. In exchange for Harvey's guilty plea, Randolph dropped 2 other charges of taking excessive loans from his bank for himself and his brother-in-law. In other words, a modern-day Russell Laffitte and Alex Murdaugh, helping themselves to excessive loans from the bank. It's funny that it was a Murdaugh that was the prosecutor in these cases, instead of the perpetrator. Randolph became known for his courtroom antics, so much so that the gallery was filled with people who came just to watch, much the way we find ourselves glued to court TV today. He remained the solicitor until 1940, but in 1939 he fell ill. In fact, he was so ill that it had been reported on a few times in the local paper. Throughout the year, his son, Randolph Jr., the original buster, had to fill in for him a few times in court, and he was hospitalized in April 1940. On July 19, 1940, after leaving a friend's home, some say a poker game, he approached a railway crossing at around 1 a.m. The train's engineer, W. Bartlett, described a very strange scenario indeed. Bartlett said he didn't see him until he was only about 40 yards away. Naturally, there were no streetlights at the time, so when the light from the train finally shone on Randolph, he raised his hand in a wave, and then proceeded to drive up onto the tracks at the last moment. Of course, there's no way to stop a moving train in that short of time and distance, so it quickly smashed into his car, hurling it 900 feet up the track, and Randolph was tossed out about 150 feet from the crossing, where he lay dead. The tragedy was written up as an accident, but the local gossip speculated anything from him being drunk to it being intentional. If he was in fact coming from a poker game, he very well may have been drunk. However, the bizarre nature of it all does make you wonder. Had he lost something big in the poker game? Was he terminally ill and decided on a way to get instant life insurance? Was he disoriented from being ill, drunk, or both? I uncovered something interesting while looking at this. The date that he was hit by the train was his wife's birthday. What transpired on that day, her birthday? His sons were now raised, one in the army, the other a lawyer ready to step into his father's shoes. Is that what was on his mind when he drove onto those tracks? Another question we'll never know the answer to. However, this was a huge piece of the rise of the Murdaughs, since Randolph's son, the original Buster Murdaugh, took no time to file a suit against the Charleston and Western Carolina Railway Company for wrongful death, filed on October 1st, 1940. It created huge wealth for the family and set them on their path to power, wealth, and influence. This was the first lawsuit against the railroad by this law firm, but not the last. It became such a regular thing for the law firm that the building is nicknamed the house that CSX built. Buster asked for $100,000 in his wrongful death suit. Adjusting for inflation, this would be $2 million today. The suit was settled on September 22, 1941 for an undisclosed amount. Where Randolph Sr. had the reputation of fighting corruption, his son found himself in a heap of trouble. Find out more on the next episode of The Murdaughs, Rise and Fall, where we'll dive into the life of Randolph Murdaugh Jr., a.k.a. Buster. Until then, this is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.